This is a fictionalized narrative style reinterpretation inspired by the public persona and musical legacy of violinist and conductor André Rieu. It does not claim to describe verified events or real personal tragedies. Instead, it weaves an imagined cinematic portrait of a musician whose life is shaped by ambition, discipline, emotional struggle, and an unrelenting devotion to music. In this retelling, music is not just performance, it is survival. Every stage becomes a battlefield of memory and meaning, every applause a fragile moment of relief, and every silence a space where personal history echoes louder than sound. The story follows a journey from childhood solitude to global recognition, and from triumph to the emotional weight of sustaining an artistic empire. What emerges is not a biography of facts, but a reflection on what it might feel like to carry beauty into the world while quietly negotiating exhaustion, expectation, and time itself. 1. Childhood in silence, where music first spoke in this imagined early life. The boy who would grow into André Rieu is born into a world that is orderly on the surface, but emotionally restrained. Beneath it, the household is shaped by discipline, precision, and unspoken expectations. Love exists, but it is rarely expressed in warmth or tenderness. Instead, it is measured through structure, routine, and performance. From an early age, the child notices something unusual. Silence has weight. It fills rooms more completely than conversation. It lingers in hallways after adults pass through. It becomes both comfort and confinement. In this silence, the boy learns to listen differently to the rhythm of footsteps, the cadence of distant voices, the hum of life beyond closed doors. When he first encounters a violin, it is not merely an instrument but an opening. The strings respond in a way people often do not. They do not judge or withdraw, they simply resonate. In this private space, practice becomes ritual. Hours pass unnoticed as the bow moves across strings, translating emotion into sound before words ever fully form. What begins as curiosity slowly transforms into necessity. Music becomes the only language that feels complete, the only place where emotion is not interrupted or minimized. Even at this early stage, there is a sense that sound is not being created. It is being discovered, as if it already existed within him, waiting for permission to emerge. 2. Conservatory years, precision versus passion as adolescence transitions into formal training. The young musician enters an environment that values control above expression. Within this fictionalized framework of André Rieu's journey, the conservatory represents both opportunity and friction. It is a place where technical mastery is rewarded, but emotional interpretation is often viewed with suspicion. Here, music is dissected into rules, timing, accuracy, restraint. The student learns quickly that deviation is rarely celebrated. Passion must be refined until it resembles discipline, yet inside, something refuses to flatten. The music he hears internally is broader, warmer, more human than what is demanded of him. Criticism becomes familiar, not always harsh, but persistent in its insistence that joy must be contained. Still, the student persists, not out of rebellion, but conviction. He begins to imagine performances not as examinations, but as shared experiences, moments where audiences are not observers, but participants. In quiet hours between rehearsals, he experiments with interpretation, bending phrases slightly, allowing melodies to breathe. These small deviations feel almost secretive, as if he is protecting something fragile from institutional rigidity. The tension between expectation and instinct becomes a defining internal conflict, yet it is also during these years that resilience forms. Not dramatic resilience, but steady persistence, the kind that grows quietly, note by note, repetition by repetition. Without knowing it, he begins building the foundation of a style that will one day challenge conventions not through confrontation, but through joy. 3. The first ensemble, building a musical world in this imagined progression. André Rieu reaches a point where interpretation is no longer enough. The desire to shape music on his own terms becomes stronger than the comfort of existing structures. From this impulse, the first ensemble begins to take form, not as an institution, but as a shared belief. It starts modestly. A small group of musicians gathers in informal spaces, borrowed rooms, modest halls, places where acoustics are imperfect, but enthusiasm is abundant. There is no certainty of success, only the shared conviction that music can feel different, less distant, more alive. Rehearsals are intense but unusually collaborative. Instead of strict hierarchy, there is conversation. Musicians are encouraged to listen not only to their parts, but to the collective sound. Mistakes are not punished harshly. They are examined, reshaped, understood. The early audiences are small, often curious rather than expectant, yet something unusual happens. People respond not just with applause, but with emotion that feels personal. Smiles linger, conversations after performances last longer than expected. Music begins to feel less like presentation and more like connection. Financial uncertainty, however, remains constant. Resources are limited, logistics fragile, and every performance carries risk. But the group continues, sustained by belief rather than security. Each concert becomes a small act of defiance against the idea that classical music must remain emotionally distant. 4. Rise to recognition. When music becomes movement as time passes in this fictionalized arc of André Rieu's journey, the ensemble evolves into something larger than its origins. Performances begin attracting wider attention, not because they abandon classical tradition, but because they reinterpret it through accessibility and warmth. Audiences grow, venues expand, the music begins to travel beyond its original context, reaching listeners who may have never attended a classical concert before. The defining characteristic is not technical revolution, but emotional invitation. People are no longer observing formality. They are experiencing atmosphere. With recognition comes pressure. Tours become more demanding, schedules tighten. The simplicity of early rehearsals gives way to complex coordination, travel, and expectation. Yet the central philosophy remains: music should feel alive. Behind the public image, however, fatigue begins to accumulate. Long travel days blur into short nights. Performances require energy that does not always replenish fully. Still, on stage, the transformation is immediate. The performer becomes animated, almost separate from exhaustion, as if music temporarily overrides physical limitation. Success in this phase is not purely celebratory. It is also structural. A growing ensemble requires leadership, decision-making, and constant adjustment. The joy of creation is now accompanied by the responsibility of sustainability. 5. The weight of leadership. An invisible orchestra. As the imagined career of André Rieu expands, leadership becomes its own form of performance. Beyond the violin and podium lies an intricate system of people, logistics, expectations, and artistic direction. The orchestra is no longer just a group of musicians. It is a living organization. Every decision carries consequence. Touring schedules affect hundreds of lives. Financial planning determines stability. Artistic choices influence public perception. What once felt like creative freedom now also feels like stewardship. There are moments of doubt, not about music itself, but about scale. How does one maintain intimacy while performing for thousands? How does one preserve emotional authenticity while operating at global magnitude? Despite these pressures, there is also pride in the structure that has been built. Musicians are supported, rehearsals are refined, and performances are crafted with care. Yet, the responsibility never fully loosens its hold. Even rest feels temporary, as though the next demand is always approaching. Leadership here is not portrayed as authority, but as continuous balancing between vision and limitation, between artistry and endurance. 6. Physical strain and emotional exhaustion in this dramatized interpretation of André Rieu's journey. the physical demands of performance gradually become more noticeable. Repetition, travel, and constant output begin to leave traces. Fatigue is no longer occasional, it becomes background noise. Yet stopping is never considered. Music by now is not just profession but identity. To pause would feel like losing continuity. Instead, adaptation becomes the strategy: shorter recovery windows, quieter moments between tours, and reliance on routine to maintain stability. Emotionally, the strain is more subtle. The contrast between public joy and private exhaustion creates a dual existence. On stage, there is brightness, movement, celebration. Off stage, there is stillness, reflection, and sometimes isolation. The violin remains central through all of it, not as burden, but as anchor. It provides continuity when schedules change and environments shift. The act of playing becomes both expression and regulation, a way to stabilize internal rhythm when external rhythm becomes unpredictable. Even in exhaustion, music does not diminish, it transforms. It becomes less about display and more about endurance, less about perfection and more about presence. 7. A world paused to silence and reflection when global disruption arrives in this fictional narrative of André Rieu's life. The absence of performance creates an unfamiliar stillness. Concert halls fall silent, tours disappear, the structured rhythm of life dissolves almost overnight. At first, silence feels disorienting. Without performance, identity feels temporarily unanchored. Days lose their usual markers. The absence of audiences creates a space that is both restful and unsettling. Gradually, however, silence becomes something else: reflection. Without external demand, music returns to its earliest form: private, exploratory, unpressured. The violin is no longer an instrument of projection, but of conversation with memory. This period allows for reassessment, not of success or failure, but of meaning. Why does music exist without audience? What remains when applause disappears? The answer, slowly revealed, is that music was never dependent on scale. It existed first in solitude, long before stages or recognition, and it continues to exist even when the world pauses. 8. Family, legacy, and continuity. In the later chapters of this fictionalized portrayal of André Rieu, attention shifts toward continuity. Family becomes an extension of musical philosophy rather than a separate world. Younger generations observe, learn, and gradually participate. There is a sense of transmission, not only of technique, but of perspective. Music is not treated as achievement alone, but as responsibility. To continue it means understanding both its joy and its demands. Within this framework, legacy is not defined by scale or fame, but by continuity of feeling. The question becomes not what has been accomplished, but what will remain meaningful when time passes. The presence of younger family members introduces renewal. Their perspective is less burdened by history, more open to reinterpretation. In their learning, the music finds new expression, slightly altered but still connected to its origin. 9. Reflection. The meaning of a musical life. At the core of this imagined journey of André Rieu lies a simple but persistent idea. Music is both fragile and resilient. It depends on human effort, yet outlives individual limitation. It carries emotion across time, even when the performer is no longer present. Looking back, the path is neither linear nor purely triumphant. It is shaped by persistence, adaptation, and continuous negotiation between inner vision and external reality. Success is not a single moment, but a sustained conversation with change. Music, in this sense, becomes less about performance and more about presence. It is a way of remaining connected to others, to memory, and to oneself. Conclusion. When music becomes memory in the end, this fictional retelling of André Rieu is not about tragedy or triumph alone, but about continuity. Music survives because it adapts. It remains because it is carried forward by people who believe in its emotional truth. What remains after applause, after tours, after silence, is not spectacle but resonance, a feeling that continues quietly, long after the final note has faded. And in that lingering sound, the story does not end, it simply continues in another form,